Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting talk with your favorite speaker, Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is one of the great avenues of the world, the Paseo de la Reforma, the grand avenue, as you can see on the picture on the right. It's me standing in the middle of the street. Behind me, it goes down for miles, and in front of me, it continues deep into Mexico. Well, like all grand avenues of the world, whether it's the Champs-Élysées in Paris, perhaps one of the most famous grand avenues, or Fifth Avenue and Broadway in New York. We'll even talk about Wall Street in New York, or Park Avenue. Other great cities have their grand avenues, Unter den Linden and Karl-Marx-Allee in Berlin, Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg. Grand avenues are a part of our urban landscape and a major part of American culture and world culture. In fact, in a couple of days, I'm going to be going to Egypt, and I'm going to be visiting the great ancient city of Luxor with its temples. And I'll walk along one of the most ancient preserved grand avenues of the ancient world, the Avenue of the Sphinx, the royal procession route for the pharaohs, and celebrating victory. You don't celebrate defeat, but you celebrate victories, or weddings, or funerals. Not long ago, I was in London, where we had the Mall, as they call it in English, or we would call it the Mall in American English. And shortly after I left, Queen Elizabeth died, and her royal carriage went down the Mall with thousands of mourners on either side. And then, a couple of weeks later, Charles was crowned, and once again, the royal gilded carriage went down the grand avenue of kings and queens through the heart of London. So our trip today is to the Paseo de la Reforma, the grand avenue of Mexico City. Well, we'll start out with a little bit of the history of Mexico and why grand avenues were so important. Who built it? Emperor Maximilian I. Gradually evolving as a city of monuments, of mansions of the rich, and then, as you can see from the picture on the right, gradually replaced by towering skyscrapers, stock market, hotels, embassies, beautiful department stores, everything along the Grand Avenue of Mexico City. So let's get started. Well, I visited and studied many grand avenues. Here on the left, you see the Kinmen Avenue in Beijing, going from the Bell Tower and the Drum Tower in the north through the Forbidden City, the whole way down to the Temple of Agriculture and the Temple of Heaven. Just last year, I was in Paris for New Year's when over 1 million people thronged the Champs-Élysées for air shows, fireworks, music, concerts. I mean, it made Times Square in New York look like nothing. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, geographically laid out with its grand avenue north and south, but an avenue going west to the ancient Indian mountains where Hinduism was born. On the right, going to be there in August, the Avenue of the Sphinx in Luxor, Egypt, going from one temple to the other. A thrilling promenade. Well, Mexico City has had its succession of grand avenues. Teotihuacan, which dates from about 100 BC as a major city, has its Grand Avenue lined by pyramids and temples with big courtyards in the middle of the Grand Avenue. On the right, you can see it's called the Avenue of the Dead, because people really didn't appreciate how important it was for the ancients. Going from the Pyramid of the Moon, passing by the Pyramid of the Sun, down to the Citadel with the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, lined with temples, and some people even say the mansions of the powerful. Well, when the Spanish conquered Mexico, they built their own city. The heart of the city was the cathedral, which we see in both pictures here, with the Zócalo, one of the largest open squares in the world, surrounded by public buildings. And if you look at the picture on the right, you see the cathedral in the middle, and then the Grand Avenue, Avenue Pino Suarez, leading from the cathedral. And here again, this was the colonial city built by the Spanish in the 1500s, not that long after Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. So the Spanish always had a cathedral, a giant square, and then a grand avenue going down through the heart of the city. Any city in South America, whether it's Brazilian or whether it's Argentinian or Colombian or Peruvian, they adopted this time-ancient method of a grand avenue. Here again, we see a map of Mexico City in 1753, where you see the Zócalo, and then you see grand avenues going in each direction from the Zócalo and the cathedral. This was one of the grand avenues of Spanish Mexico City, the Calle de Balvanera, and this map dates from 1753. This is the Zócalo as it looks today, with a giant flag filled with hundreds of thousands of people. There's always something going on there, whether it's a demonstration, a protest, or what. This is the place where you protest. Well, Mexico City, the center, is an old Spanish city. It's delightful to see the architecture, the stone carvings of angels and saints on corners, elegant buildings such as one on the right with a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary up in the top. This is the old colonial city, and most of these buildings are protected. This is the Centro Histórico, the central historic section of old Mexico City. Well, Mexico City entered a very dramatic chapter in its history when an emperor took over. Well, Mexico and most of the countries of South and Central America declared their independence from Spain shortly after the United States got its independence. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, eventually Brazil, Peru. And the Mexican Revolution was part of this from 1810 to 1821. Mexico, with its gold and silver mines and agricultural riches, was one of the last places the Spanish were willing to let go, and they fought fiercely. Well, several places never did manage to get their independence, such as Cuba and Puerto Rico, which remained Spanish colonies until the United States invaded in the Spanish-American War, when we stole not only the Philippines and islands in the Pacific, but we stole Cuba and Puerto Rico. Eventually, we gave Puerto Rico its independence. Cuba got its independence, but Puerto Rico remains an American colony until today. Well, like most revolutions, they kick out the elite and set up their own government. Some of the countries fell into dictatorship. Other countries, such as Brazil and Mexico, a person declared himself a new emperor. But most of these emperors were short-lived, and they were overthrown by either a dictator or a democratic government. Well, one of the people who took over in Mexico was commonly called Iturbide. We see him on the right. He declared himself the Emperor of Mexico. Well, his rule was rather short, 1822 to 1823, barely a year. But this is the Iturbide Palace. Once again, the glorious stonework and stone carvings right in the historic center of the city. It's a museum today that anybody can visit, with a big, beautiful courtyard. Well, Iturbide was overthrown, and Mexico went through a succession of dictators, presidents, elections, revolutions, coups d'etats, and like most South American countries, had great difficulty settling into a stable government. Well, the United States didn't help very much, because we were expanding from the 13 colonies to the Mississippi. And then most Americans and governments and military people had their eyes on the Pacific Ocean. We call this manifest destiny. Well, the British kept control of Canada and most of the Midwestern area, but the Mexican Empire of Iturbide had everything up to the Mississippi River, today's California, Texas, Arizona, Montana, even the whole way up to Utah. Well, the United States gradually went to declared that America was for the Americans. And so this was the famous Monroe Doctrine, which told Europeans, don't even think of meddling in the affairs of the Caribbean or Latin America or Central America. The United States is the #1 power in the Americas. Well, we had no problem sending our troops into South America and taking what we wanted. If Venezuela wasn't able to pay its debts, well, the American Marines would go in, loot the country for whatever they wanted, kill the president, overthrow him, put in a puppet. We did that many times and continue to do it many times in places like Haiti and Central America. So the American policy was expand to the Pacific, dominate the Americas, and eventually go to war to expand our country. So in 1846 to 1848, the United States invaded Mexico. We annexed Texas, California, everything in between. Basically, we occupied Mexico City, put a gun to the then president of Mexico City and saying, give us everything we want, or we'll put a hole through your head. So finally, manifest destiny was achieved. We got the whole way to the Pacific, San Diego, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all of these great cities, Corpus Christi, became American cities. So Mexico lost a huge area. Now, true, it was poorly populated, not more than a couple thousand Mexicans in what is today California, and Texas was being overrun with immigrants from the United States, white Protestants bringing in their slaves to grow even more cotton. So we took over what we wanted. Well, Mexico was definitely on the losing end of this war. Well, along came the American Civil War, and that was 1860 to 65. We all know Abraham Lincoln and all that kind of stuff. Well, the southern states from Texas to Virginia declared themselves to be a new country, an independent country called the Confederate States of America. The North remained the United States of America. Well, the war was long and drawn out, but eventually, as we know, the southern states were defeated and they were forced back into the American Union. Well, the southern states had a plan, as you can see on the picture on map on the right. The Southern Confederates planned to expand even further at the expense of Mexico and even annex Cuba, all of Mexico, Central America, and even parts of Colombia and Argentina and Venezuela, as well as the islands in the Caribbean. This was the dream of the Confederate States of America, and a slave society, the southern part of the United States and all of the Caribbean coastline would be annexed into the Confederate States of America. Well, when the southern states were defeated by Abraham Lincoln, this dream was never fulfilled. So the United States respected the new boundary of Mexico and the annexation of Texas and California, and everything was going to be okay. Well, into this story marches Emperor Maximilian I of the great ruling family of huge chunks of Europe, the Habsburg family. Well, the Habsburgs, supported by the French, saw the American Civil War as an opportunity. The United States is bogged down in this civil war. The Monroe Doctrine was still in effect on paper, but the United States was not in a position to keep the Europeans from meddling in South America. So the French organized an army. They hired Maximilian. His name was Ferdinand Maximilian Joseph Maria von Habsburger-Lothringen. And they said, well, he was an unemployed prince of the Habsburg family based in Vienna. So he was, like most princes, looking for a job. He was not going to become the Emperor of Austria because his brother was going to get that job. So the French said, okay, well, we're going to go and take over Mexico. Why don't you come with us and we'll make you the emperor and we will keep you in power. Well, right in the middle of the Civil War, the French arrived, invaded Mexico in 1864 in April, occupied Mexico City, put Emperor Maximilian and his wife as emperor, and they ruled from 64 to 67, another chapter of Imperial Mexico. Well, the Austrian Empire was very powerful, ruled over by the Habsburgs, and the Habsburgs owned huge lands in northern Italy, Yugoslavia, as well as the states in Germany, France, and Holland. Well, the new Emperor Maximilian of Mexico joined his fellow emperors as ruling the best part of the world. Russia was ruled by the Romanov family, the giant Russian Empire. Austrian Empire controlled today's Czechoslovakia, Hungary, huge chunks of Poland, Romania, modern-day Yugoslavia, and northern Italy. Eventually, in the 1870s, Germany united, and you had the King of Prussia crowning himself the Emperor of Germany. The Ottoman Turks had their Pasha, who was an emperor ruling over huge chunks of the Balkans and the Middle East. The British Empire, Victoria, was crowned Empress of India. And then even Napoleon, when he grabbed power, he crowned himself the Emperor of France. Well, there were a couple other emperors roaming around the world. You had the Emperor of Ethiopia, you had the Emperor of Japan, the Emperor of China, and you had a couple of other people in Africa who aspired to be emperors as well. But Maximilian I came from royal blood, Habsburgs going back to the Middle Ages. So he said, I am now an emperor, like Napoleon and Ethiopia, Japan, China, Russia. He was an emperor among emperors. Well, the Mexican government was defeated, and the French invaded, put Maximilian I on the throne with his wife, Empress Charlotta, and he was going to drag Mexico, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. In fact, he, like many emperors, was aware that Mexico was a rather backward, poor country. And so he set out to be the savior of Mexico, bringing jobs, bringing wealth, bringing advancement. And he thought he could win over the souls, the love, and the taxes of the people of Mexico. He moved into Chapultepec Palace, which had begun back in the colonial period by the Spanish on a hilltop outside of Mexico City. Began in 1785, gradually enlarging itself by different kings and different emperors, such as Maximilian and other presidents and dictators. That's how it looks today. And you can see all the pollution and the smog behind it. Mexico City is in a bowl, and all the exhaust from automobiles stays there. On the right, you see the very regal-looking Emperor Maximilian with his crown, his ermine cape, standing in Chapultepec Castle. This is another view, and you can see how big the castle is. Well, like Versailles in France, the royal palaces were generally in the suburbs, surrounded by beautiful gardens, and it was a distance from the congested downtown area. The map on the right, see on the middle and the left, there's an X. That's where Chapultepec Palace was, pretty much outside the city. And the area colored, the Zona Rosa, the Roma, Navarre, Polanco, and then you see the Centro, the yellow part. And so you can see how far the palace was from the center, which is exactly what the rulers of Mexico, as well as the kings of Europe, wanted. A peaceful residence castle outside the city, surrounded by gardens with peacocks roaming around, safely removed from any hint of revolution or uprising against the president, the dictator, or in the case of Maximilian, emperor. Well, Maximilian set about transforming Chapultepec Palace into a palace to rival any of his fellow emperors, whether it was Japan, China, Russia, Germany, Austria, Ethiopia. He brought over tons of European, predominantly French, pianos, paintings of himself, objets d'art, carpets, had the palace turned into a palace worthy of one of the great emperors of the world. Chapultepec Palace is a museum. It's best to reserve your tickets online before you go, so you don't have to stand in line, although that is a possibility. Really, it is a marvelous palace to visit. Well, he not only modernized Chapultepec Palace, but he was going to modernize his country. He built the very first railroad linking Mexico City down to Veracruz on the coast. He was going to bring imports from Europe, export the wealth of Mexico to the coast. Branches were built to Puebla off of it and other ones down along the coast, funneling everything to Veracruz. This was called the Imperial Mexican Railroad, begun by Maximilian, 1864, but it took another 10 years when Maximilian was no longer there to finish. So he was very much a modernizer. Well, he also realized that the old Spanish city of Mexico, with its cathedral and its Zocalo, big square, and its grand avenues, was nice, but he wanted to leave his mark on the city. At the same time as he was taking power in Mexico, Austrian capital of Vienna was demolishing its city walls. The walls which had surrounded the city from the Middle Ages. They were demolishing the walls and they were building what is called the Ringstrasse in Vienna, a giant, beautiful boulevard lined with palaces, opera houses, cathedrals, palaces of the wealthy, hotels, a beautiful brand new avenue going around the city. Paris had already demolished its city wall and replaced it with the grand avenues. So this was his plan, Maximilian's plan, to bring Mexico from the Middle Ages to the modern world, make it as beautiful as Vienna or Paris or Rome or Milan, the great cities of Europe. He was going to add Mexico City to his future book on the 100 great cities of the world. Well, he laid out a boulevard. And this picture, which is in a cafe along the Paseo de la Reforma, shows one of the early photographs of the Paseo. It was taken from the terrace of Chapultepec Palace. You can see it's a long, straight, very, very wide avenue with trees that were planted. You only see one mansion on the right-hand side, and it goes the whole way from the Chapultepec Palace into the center of Mexico City. Well, like every grand avenue, you got to start somewhere, and so he laid it out, and he had a great vision. Here we see the Paseo de la Reforma. The bottom, you see the Chapultepec Palace. Today, it's lined with statues, a statue of Diana, famous angel, statue of Christopher Columbus, Xotamek, the last Aztec king, and going right to Alameda and Zocalo, right into the heart of Mexico City. Well, of course, when he was laying it out, there was nothing of this on either side, except the palace up on the hill, a big open avenue, very wide, and going down into the center of the old part of Mexico. It was called the Paseo de la Emperatriz, meaning the promenade of the Empress, his wife. It's 9.1 miles long. I walk it all the time when I'm there. And it goes from Chapultepec Palace on the hill down to the big, beautiful Alameda Park. Well, Alameda Park is dominated these days by the Opera House, which you see in the right. And along Alameda Park, monuments, such as the one below, were built. But most of the 9.1 miles was still unpopulated during the time of the emperor. Well, Emperor Maximilian didn't last too long. He was shot on June 19th, 1867, and that marked the end of the Mexican Empire. Marie Charlotte returned to her home in Belgium. According to my knowledge, she went insane and was locked up in a convent. And that marked the end of Maximilian I. But the Paseo de la Reforma remained very much alive. Here again, we see the palace. We see the X in the bottom, in the middle, on the left, and the Y in the center of the city. Well, the new Mexican government hired Ferdinand von Rosenzweig to supervise the building of the Paseo de la Reforma, as it was renamed. He was an Austrian general and architect and city planner, and he was going to make the Paseo de la Reforma as beautiful as the Champs-Élysées or Unter den Linden or the Ringstrasse in Vienna. Well, the new president was Jose de la Cruz Porfirio Diaz Mori. And his rule, which is 1876 to 1911, really transformed Mexico. In fact, he kept everything that the Maximilian had planned, he realized. And this whole period, for the few periods in Mexico of stability, was called the Porfirio period of Mexican history. Book on the right, President of Mexico and master builder of a great commonwealth. So he set out to build the magnificent avenue that Maximilian had envisaged. Well, various monuments were built in the middle of the street because it was so wide, it didn't much interfere with traffic. And so you just go or drive around them very comfortably. One of the very first statues to be put up was the Christopher Columbus statue, which stood there from 1877 until the year 2020. When Mexico, like the United States and other countries, are reanalyzing the role of Christopher Columbus. Yes, he discovered America. Yes, he began the European conquest of the continents. But also, he was considered the person who launched the genocide of the Native Americans. So in the year 2020, the Mexican government took down the statue of Columbus and they replaced it with a statue that had been recently found by archaeologists dating from the Aztec period. And this was the young woman of Amajek. So this was put up on the pedestal, and today, surrounded by trees and fountains, is one of the new monuments along the Paseo de la Reforma. A year later, 1878, a monument was raised to Chamotac, the last Aztec ruler. On the left, you can see the way it was in the beginning in 1878, when trees were gradually filling out. On the right, that's what it looks like today. You can see the glistening new buildings all over the place. The Angel is another beautiful monument. And this was one of the last great accomplishments of Porfirio Diaz. This is the Angel of Independence. Well, you can see that Paseo de la Reforma is becoming a major avenue with glistening new buildings on both sides. And in the far distance, you see Chapultepec Palace up on the hill, shrouded in pollution. Well, if you go there in the spring, you're going to see these absolutely magnificent flowering trees. These are the jacaranda trees, which were planted following a visit by one of the Mexican presidents, Ortiz Rubio, to Washington, D.C. He was so impressed by the cherry blossoms announcing the arrival of spring in Washington, D.C., that he had these trees, jacaranda trees, planted the length of the Paseo. These trees are indigenous to South America. They are very popular everywhere these days because they have such a beautiful, almost lilac color to them. Originally, they planted various trees, eucalyptus, ash, palm, willow trees, but they had to have palm trees. This is the 1922 constructed palm tree roundabout. Today, there are still palm trees there, although in the picture on the left, you don't see many buildings there. A couple of cars and a couple of smaller mansions are there. But on the right today, you see the Mexican stock market. That's the Wall Street area of Mexico City, right along the magnificent Paseo de la Reforma. 1942, another monument. This is the Huntress Diana Fountain. And on the left, you can see it's getting closer to Chapultepec Palace, trees on both sides, towering skyscrapers surrounding it. Once again, almost a total transformation as the Paseo was being filled in with buildings. Each decade, they were getting taller and more imposing. In 1952, the Monumento a los Niños Héroes was put on another roundabout. This is in honor of the military cadets, most of them young guys, very young teenagers or even younger, who were studying at the military academy. And when the United States invaded Mexico, they were mobilized and unceremoniously massacred by the American army as it marched to Mexico City to steal a third of Mexico. So this is not a very popular monument for American tourists. We tend to, like most countries, airbrush out of history our crimes, but highlight those of everybody else. So again, one of the newer monuments on the Paseo. Well, initially, these tall buildings, as you can see from the picture on the right, were not there. The government encouraged well-to-do Mexicans to build mansions along Paseo, very much like Fifth Avenue. Look at the old pictures of Fifth Avenue. They're all the Vanderbilt, the Rockefeller, the mansions lining the street. Well, today, few of those mansions remain either on Paseo de Reforma or on Fifth Avenue. Most of them are gone. But today, here you see this picture from the 1950s where there were some old cars there and mansions along both sides. And here you get a good impression of how wide the street is. I mean, you see lanes in the middle with a roundabout in the middle of the picture, trees on either side, and then another lane for cars and sidewalks. So it's very much like Robert Moses' concept of the parkway, where park and highway are blended. Now, many of the wealthy people of Mexico City were immigrants from Europe. In fact, today, as I speak, the wealthiest man in Mexico is Carlos Slim, who is a Lebanese Arab who migrated to Mexico and got control of the telecommunications and radio and all of that, and is today one of the wealthiest people in the world, and by far the wealthiest person in Mexico. Well, one of the wealthy immigrants was Thomas Braniff Woods, and he built one of the few mansions which still remain intact. This dates from 1898. And this is very similar to the mansions along Fifth Avenue, very much French-inspired architecture with the mansard sloping roof on the top floor. This is the Casa Scherer, which existed from 1906 to 1947. Again, another wealthy, I believe he was German or Swiss, who migrated to Mexico and made a fortune and added his mansion to Paseo. On the right, you see the star in the middle of the picture. That's where the mansion was. And you can see the buildings which surround it today. Sir Patrick Olley, a British businessman, built this mansion in 1929. Today it is a Mac store. And you can see at the top of the picture, it is totally surrounded, even dominated by giant skyscrapers. But now it is once again open, and it's a good place to go in to see how much has been preserved of the ballrooms, dining rooms, reception rooms. And so the Mexicans are becoming a bit more concerned with historic preservation. And so most of these mansions are going to be preserved in perpetuity. Here again, you see the mansion with the tower surrounding it, like a wraparound tower. And on the right, you see the full-scale tower over the modest two-story mansion. These are other mansions which still remain. On the left, you see one, once again, totally dominated by a giant tower. Others are still standing, but other buildings are being torn down, such as the one in the upper right. The older nondescript buildings to its left will no doubt be torn down sometime in the near future, and another giant skyscraper will take over. Well, the Paseo de la Reforma continues to evolve. This is the McDonald's Paseo de la Reforma restaurant. most countries call McDonald's a restaurant. In the United States, it is a McDonald's fast food, whereas in the United States, we make the distinction between Burger King, McDonald's, and Pizza Hut as fast food places. And then a restaurant is a more formal sit-down place. But in most other languages, McDonald's is considered the height of American cuisine. I go there very often because Mexico still gives free coffee refills. So something to note in your next travel agenda. On the right, we see the angel. Beautiful nighttime photographs. Mexicans love to illuminate buildings with bright lights. And here you see the purple pedestal of the angel. You see the traffic so easily going around it, and other buildings brilliantly illuminated. Along the Paseo is the famous Zona Rosa. That is a walking street today filled with discos, with bars, highly patrolled by the police because it is a major money earner for the city, and tourism is one of the biggest Mexican businesses. But as you walk down, you see, once again, as soon as you leave the Paseo, you see a large number of older buildings. Some of them are very nice. Because not everybody could afford to build a mansion on the Paseo, but they built mansions nearby. And so this is one of the biggest entertainment areas. Bars catering to every task, or to every taste, I should say, are conveniently located there. More and more monuments are being put up all along the Paseo, celebrating poets, celebrating literary figures, imaginary figures, both men, women, aliens. Almost every time I go, there are new monuments being put up along the street. Some of them are very modern, such as the one we see on the right, which is about the point where the Paseo de Reforma enters old Mexico City. On the left, another rather abstract sculpture, which is very comfortably at home. There again is me standing there, as you can see, with a straight Paseo going behind me with magnificent buildings the whole way down to Chapultepec Palace. A great place to go walking. This is another view of the Bourse, as they call it, which is one of the big financial sections of the city. Very often the Paseo is roped off for various events. Very often on a Sunday, it will be devoted to bicycles or to jogging, or you'll see people doing sports in the street. Mexicans have been inundated with junk food from America, and obesity is a major problem. And so the government is encouraging mass participation in such activities as bicycling, jogging, gymnastics in the middle of the street, dance to music. So it is not just a street for traffic. It's not just a place for beautiful buildings and monuments, but it is the place for public displays, demonstrations, protests, political rallies, gay rights protests, women's movements, minority movements. You never know what you're going to see on the Paseo. Well, grand avenues, whether it's the Paseo de la Reforma, whether it is the Avenue of the Pharaohs, or whether it is Kingman in Beijing, these are the great avenues of the ancient and the modern world. Well, grand avenues are also part of the future. When the Republic of Kazakhstan decided to build a new capital, it went up into one of the northern desert areas and laid out a brand new capital city called Astana. Periodically, it was called Nur Sultan after the dictator of the time, so it has changed names a couple of times. But as you can see from the architecture, it is monumental. And you see the Grand Avenue going the length of the city with a monument with a golden globe on the top, the far end surrounded by sparkling skyscrapers, and continuing on for miles through this brand new capital city. Another city with a grand avenue is Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil, or the city of Abuja in Nigeria, built out of nothing as a new capital for a new country. So grand avenues are more than just a big street. Think of Fifth Avenue in New York. Demonstrations, gay pride, national pride, Irish, cathedrals, stores, churches, synagogues, hotels, restaurants. The Empire State Building is on Fifth Avenue. Here again, one of the great grand avenues of the world. So, thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Ronald Brown logging off. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you shortly in the future for another exciting visit to some exciting place in the world. So, thank you again. This is Ron Brown logging off.